It's Friday, March 28th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today in the show, we're going to do something just a little bit different. I had the pleasure of getting a really great guest this week, and instead of cutting down our conversation for time like I normally do, I thought the entire thing would be worth listening to. Our guest this week is Jason R. Barron, professor at the University of Maryland and the former director of litigation at the National Archives, which makes him the perfect person to talk to about the fallout from the use of Signal to talk about the Yemen bombing campaign by some of our top American officials, including J.D. Vance. And then in that group chat, Atlantic Editor-in-Chief Jeffrey Goldberg was accidentally added too, if you haven't been keeping up with the news. Barron was also the only person in the Atlantic's article about this week who went on the record, who also wasn't the government spokesperson, to talk about the issues that this group posed. Now, if you haven't listened to Wednesday's episode, which is a breakdown of what this group chat was and how this story is unfolding, or you haven't read the most recent articles on the Make It Make Sense Substack about how this actually is bigger than just a group chat, you might want to listen to that or go read those before you listen to this. You don't have to, but they will give you some better context about the conversation you're about to hear. Otherwise, let's get to today's conversation with Professor Jason R. Barron. Jason, before we get rolling, I want to say something, and I know it's going to kind of put you on the spot a little bit here because we just talked about it before the camera was on, but you did turn down a couple pretty big national outlets to talk about this, but instead you're here. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
I'm happy to be here.
And you said when we talked before that I said some magic words here about records keeping, and that's what I want to talk about today when we talk about the Signal Gate, Signal Ghazi, whatever people want to call this thing. Let's start with, as you've been watching this thing play out, and today we got the full text chain, does this thing violate certain ideas about how our national secrets, our national records are kept? Does it violate some of those ideas that you tried to preserve while at the National Archives?
You know, as we talked, would very much like to focus our conversation about record keeping in the government. But let me say that there's a certain level of incredulousness around Washington, D.C. It's expressed by senators and by others that are in the media about how the administration is characterizing the level of classification or not for this group chat. In my experience, I held a TSSCI clearance for 25 years while at the Justice Department and then at the National Archives. I think it's pretty clear to many fair-minded observers that the kind of operational details that are in this group chat would normally be considered classified at top secret. They're highly sensitive. As a technical matter, it may well be that DOD did not stamp the conversation top secret. In fact, as we will talk, I'm not sure that the conversation would have been preserved as a record so as to then get a classification stamp. It's not like a normal document that we think of that might be attached to an email that has top secret stamped on it. So I don't want to speculate too much about whether there are concerns about laws being broken with respect to a classified document because the administration is saying it's not classified. Right. And so that's a different track of a conversation, and you would need another guest on your program to talk about the Espionage Act and what would normally happen if there was a leak of this kind that was essentially started by an invite from the National Security Advisor to a journalist. That is a pretty rare event, and that's why the story is so big that many of us who spent decades in Washington have never actually seen anything like this before. But, you know, you and I should concentrate on sort of the secondary aspect of of the story. And it's a really interesting one in my mind about the use of disappearing message apps, for communications in government. And we can talk at length about that.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking on Wednesday. Listeners are hearing this on Friday, but in the Wednesday episode, I talk about how there are certain stories that are outside of the just general scandal of what this thing is. And among them is the idea that you've got government officials seeming to say that they're using Signal on their private phones, and then Signal is an app that by design in its own terms of service says it's not meant to store or collect any of those messages or information. And some of these messages, at least by Goldberg's description in The Atlantic, were that they were on a disappearing timer. So when it comes to preserving records, before we get to that, what are the laws about preserving official communications, and how do we know that people are preserving them the way that they are supposed to when they're not using apps like Signal?
Right. So first of all, let me say, yes, I know there's a delay in this recording. So who knows what may come out on a daily basis in this story between now and when you air this. But it was interesting at yesterday's hearing. Let me just start with this, that Ms. Gabbard, as the director of national intelligence, would not answer whether or not she used her own phone or a government phone. Now, for my purposes, that doesn't really make a difference under the records laws, as I will explain. The second thing is that there's, I'm sure the listeners here would wish to know that there are different rules in place for classified communications. There's clear guidance in multiple administrations that if you're going to have a top secret conversation with other officials or any employees, normally that's conducted in a SCIF, which is a very secure facility, or it's on a government network that has been blessed by the NSA or by CIA or by DOD or whatever, as has sufficient encryption and controls. So there's that, which is that if you're talking about top secret or equivalent classified communications, so there's that overlay of national security concerns. But then there's a second layer that applies to all communications that government individuals have that are 99% of which are unclassified. And so that's where I've lived as a lawyer for decades at the Justice Department and the National Archives. And so let me just then answer what you really want to know, which is that there are two statutes which are applicable to this group chat. One is the Presidential Records Act, and one is the Federal Records Act. And the Presidential Records Act covers what the president, the vice president, and certain members of the White House that solely advise the president. So on this chat, it would include the chief of staff and maybe an assistant like Stephen Miller and National Security Council members. So they're covered under the Presidential Records Act, and every presidential record is a permanent record of the United States that is supposed to go to the National Archives at the end of the presidential term.
Right. It doesn't belong to the president or the people who sent those messages or the people involved in those messages. In the context of what we're talking about here, it belongs to the United States and the National Archives, right?
It belongs to the American people, just like every email that a president sends or his staff sends, his immediate staff. And that's a special statute, which actually got in the news in the last couple of years because of Mar-a-Lago. We can talk about that, but that's a side issue for today. Then there's the rest of government. And there were a lot of individuals on this chat who were high-level officials of agencies, including the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of the CIA. There were individuals from Treasury and, in other places. And so for all of those individuals, they're covered under the Federal Records Act. And they create federal records that need to be preserved. They may not all be permanent. They could be temporary records under agency schedules. But in any event, here's how the world works. So both statutes have a provision in them that specifically talks about electronic messaging. So the law was put into effect in 2014. And for the last 11 years, the statutes, both the Presidential Records Act, the Federal Records Act, has said that if you are communicating on a non-government, non-official communications channel, for example, Gmail would be electronic messaging on a non-official channel, you need to forward or copy those messages to an official government account or channel, a .gov. So in email, it's easy. Gmail, you would, if you're having a conversation about government business, and that includes whether it's a government phone or a personal phone. If you're talking about official business, the statutes say that individuals should take some steps to make sure that those messages are preserved on a government system. Now, in 2014, we didn't have ephemeral apps the way that we do now. So Congress didn't anticipate what really is a big issue here, which is that we really can't expect that each member of this chat would take the time to preserve every message in the chat or the chat itself. And there's some questions about how easy it would be to do that on Signal. And so there is this issue, but the statute is very clear that everything that was said on this chat is a record, and it needs to be preserved for at least some period of time. And, well, there's lots of questions about doing that if you also have put into effect a time by which that the messages will disappear. The statute would say you need to preserve those messages before they disappear. Whether anyone did that is something that I don't know the answer to.
Right. I mean, a judge in the first Trump administration, where this was brought up because Steve Bannon was using Signal in the White House as trying to not have a paper trail from the Oval Office, a judge in D.C., I think it was American Oversight, sued over these Signal messages, said that when he was dismissing the case, because they didn't have standing, but said that the use of Signal ran afoul of these laws, but they continued to use them. I also know that Signal was cleared under the Biden administration for limited use in certain senses. So is the problem we're running into here, or at least one of them, just that we don't have the laws or the understanding of how these things work and how people use them, or is that sort of not really the case?
Well, let me play lawyer here for a moment. And that case was brought by Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, CREW.
Yes.
American Oversight sues a lot. In fact, they just sued in this situation to claim that this chat were federal records. So that's a lawsuit filed this week. But back in the first Trump administration, there was this lawsuit, and you are correct that the holding of the case was that individuals and a public interest group didn't have standing to micromanage the president's records management policies. And so what was at issue there was Confide and Signal. And the issues were, should the president be managing those communications as records, and whether or not individuals followed the law was left, the courts say it would be left to the president and his advisors to ensure that the Presidential Records Act, were followed. And that's a circumstance that it's a longstanding law about carving out the president. On the other hand, one can sue under the Federal Records Act in some circumstances to ensure that the Justice Department takes some action when there's been destruction of messages. So that's the legal point. Now, I also want to say very clearly that, as I said in the Atlantic article, that Signal and other forms of ephemeral apps are prohibited for use even in unclassified circumstances, except if you copy or forward. So the message to a governmental system. So that's that condition. So it's not an outright prohibition, either back in the Trump first administration or Biden or now. You can use these forms of communications. You can use Gmail. You can do that as long as you fulfill the statutory condition of preserving records. So if you don't do that, then you shouldn't be having the conversation at all. But it's not, I mean, agencies could on their own. That's what the statute says.
Mm-hmm.
An agency which is responsible for its own records management policies, an agency like DOD or CIA could say no one should use Signal. But that's actually not what has occurred. My understanding from public reporting is that in the Biden administration, Signal was thought to be a best practice because of its encryption, its end-to-end encryption feature for high-level officials to use in some situations. But those situations involved unclassified matters, just normal back and forth conversations about government policy. So, so there we are. We're in this world where, yes, there is a presumption that you really shouldn't be able to. You shouldn't be using these forms of communications unless you take certain steps to make sure that the records are preserved.
Right.
And that makes sense. We are not in our offices anymore, especially post-COVID. We are scattered around the globe, and we're at homes. We're in other, means when we're going between places. We all use smart devices, and so it's perfect. You can see that there are occasions where one would want to talk about government business. But one would hope that those smart devices are also configured to have an email account that it will be archived in a government system. And there could be other ways to configure devices to have SMS texting or other forms of communications that will be automatically archived. The problem with Signal is that there's a really open question whether any agency is automatically archiving this.
Right.
And
right.
probably the individuals on the chat did not, although I don't know that for sure.
Right. We don't know that yet. No, none of them have said anything to that extent. You would seem to think that if they were doing that, they would say, hey, this was backed up, and sort of try to stop this specific line of thinking from coming at them. But I think I also want to talk about here something that's a little bit bigger than just the use of Signal and the law, but what do we lose by not having these records in any case when a government official isn't preserving communication? To me, just like I've talked about before on the show and in the Substack about the loss of data, we're losing a historical knowledge, an understanding of what the government was doing at that point in time. So is that how you also see these archives?
You're exactly right. And let me tell you a story, because I got into this world as a lawyer at the Justice Department in 1992. But there was a lawsuit filed involving Ollie North and Iran-Contra records that were on backup tapes. And on the last day of the Reagan administration, there was a lawsuit, a temporary restraining order, to stop the destruction of backup tapes because they contained what's known as Prof's notes, which was an early version of email that had Ollie North and John Poindexter's Prof's notes on it. And plaintiffs thought that for history's sake, they should be preserved. And that lawsuit lasted for a very long time into the 1990s, and I was lead lawyer on it from 1992. I wasn't at the beginning. And let me tell you, back in the 1980s, very long ago, the National Security Council had guidance that said, don't use the Prof system for official communications. It's just like a telephone. Well, Ollie North did use it. And for official communications. Those prof's notes were preserved. And because of the lawsuit ever since 1994, White House email in all of its forms has been archived. And we can talk more about the rest of the government too. But here's the thing, whenever any new technology comes out, email was the new shiny object in the 1980s. But then there's a profusion of other types of communications. And in the last decade, these kind of ephemeral apps have somewhat replaced email in communicating between individuals, although email is still the default way that government employees talk to each other. But with every new technology, there's this question, well, should it be preserved? I mean, is it really a record? And the answer is that email is one of the most candid media to know what your government is up to hold it accountable for its actions, because people say things in email that they wouldn't necessarily say in more formal memoranda or documents like that. And so it's all records, and much of it is important records, not everything. There's a lot of email. If you're having a meeting in room 104 down the hall, that email or a message is not worth preserving beyond, the day of the meeting. And the National Archives accounts for that in the federal side for agencies. There's lots of email and lots of messages that they may be records technically, but they're not important records. This chat certainly appears to be an important record, high-level officials talking about war strikes before they happen, and whether or not they're term military plans. They are very sensitive matters. And this is the kind of record that I think the American people deserve to have preserved about the actions that the Trump administration has taken. And across the board, every day, there are hundreds of high-level discussions about all matters of policy. And we can go down the list in this administration, but, the Biden administration, whatever, Obama and Trump, in any administration, there are hundreds and hundreds of matters that are discussed at high levels through email and somewhat through these messaging apps, although with the requirements that I said. And so I think we deserve to know what it is that the government is talking about. And if this is the way that they communicate and discuss options and recommendations about policies, then we should know about it. And we are able to know about it through the Freedom of Information Act.
I do want to talk about that, because I think that this instance with this chat also, and I've talked about this before, I talked about it in the Wednesday episode and on the Substack again, that this chat is a part of a pattern that we've come to understand from a Trump administration, whether it's the current one or the previous one, that is a sort of disregard to potentially disdain for records keeping. Donald Trump had a pattern of ripping up documents, and then someone would have to tape them back together. There were obviously all sorts of record keeping problems with Mar-a-Lago. And then in this current term, you've got folks like Elon Musk and his employees, the people under him, stopping their use of internal communication to try to find a server that's outside of FOIA laws. The administration trying to move the efforts of DOJ outside of FOIA laws into a thing that wouldn't make them publicly accessible for 5 years after Donald Trump is out of office. And then things like firing FOIA workers and the National Archivist. So do you see all of these things as sort of the same thing, or am I too far out over my skis on this?
Okay, so you said a lot there.
I did.
Let me try to construct it a little. First of all, I just want to say for the record that you said the Trump administration in its first iteration was not paying attention to or oblivious of record keeping requirements. I think 99.9% of people who work in the federal government try to do the right thing. So in that administration, to the extent we're talking about civil servants, they're they're trying to do the right thing with respect to record keeping. For I would say that most high-level officials, political types, are pretty much aware of their responsibilities, and I have been part of a movement in government to use technology to relieve the burden on them to preserve like emails that it's done automatically. So there's that. But of course, you are correct that through public reporting, we are aware of a number of instances where President Trump seemed to treat documents in the White House as not necessarily permanent records of the United States. He either shred them or find some other means.
Right.
To
Maybe, yeah, I said
destroy
disdain.
them.
Maybe that's the wrong word for it. Maybe flippant is the right word. A flippant approach.
Yeah. And that's your characterization. I would say that I think it's unfortunate. It came out in the special counsel's lawsuit regarding Mar-a-Lago that there's, at least to some extent, there seems to be an argument that President Trump and his lawyers were running that what was taken was personal records. Frankly, that's just wrong as a matter of law. The only personal items that a president can do is like a diary or a letter to his family. But everything about official business and every classified record that was at Mar-a-Lago, but anything that was sent, virtually all of it were presidential records that should have gone to the National Archives. So you're right about that in that instance, that was quite eye-opening to the staff of the National Archives. Now, to complete the thought, you had two other thoughts here about both about Mr. Musk and about the firing of the archivist and whatever that I want to address. So if you indulge me.
Please.
So with respect to the firing of the archivist, President Trump, he participated in a program with Hugh Hewitt, a radio program earlier in this administration, within the last couple months. And Mr. Hewitt asked President Trump questions about what he was going to do because the former archivist hated President Trump. That's what Mr. Hewitt said. And I know that's not true. I know David Ferriero, the former archivist. I worked with him. The archives is a nonpartisan place. I have written an article on this in the Washington Monthly. You can have a link for your readers or whatever, for your viewers. The current archivist who was fired, Dr. Colleen Shogan, had nothing to do with Mar-a-Lago. And so that's point one. And point two is every single person at the National Archives, other than the appointment of the archivist himself or herself, is a civil servant. It is a thoroughly nonpartisan place. And it is, in my view, unfortunate. I've said this in a number of places. Very unfortunate to cast the archives as acting in some partisan fashion when all people wanted to do was recover presidential records and make sure that the American people have those records for history's sake. And when the boxes were finally recovered after a year of negotiations, turned out some of those records were classified. And so National Archives people worked with DOJ to give them a heads up and then to take further actions to make sure that there weren't any other classified records at Mar-a-Lago. But I feel that the National Archives, the staff have been smeared. And I know for a fact, having worked there for 13 years and defended them for almost a decade before that, that these are wonderful people. They come to work every day and all they want to do is preserve history for all of us. So that's that. And now, if you'll indulge me one more.
I did this to you. This is, yeah.
You asked about Doge and Elon Musk. And I think on that score, the administration has every right to decide that a component, that some staff that it sets up in a new component of the executive office of the president are essentially presidential in nature. That is, that they're advising the president. And DOJ is on record as filing a declaration saying that Elon Musk is an advisor to the president. The DOJ staff, Department of Government Efficiency, well, under an executive order that he issued early on, they took over something called the U.S. Digital Service, which was renamed as DOJ.
Yes.
DOJ Temporary Service. And there is a legitimate issue whether or not those individuals and Mr. Musk are operating as solely advisors to the president, or are they operating as kind of an oversight of government agencies in their interactions? Anyway, that the administration has said that DOJ is not a FOIA agency. It is part of the White House. And again, that goes back to the Presidential Records Act, the Federal Records Act. If it's presidential, if it's a presidential component, then we can't file FOIA requests against DOJ. And that's what the Justice Department is currently arguing. It remains to be seen. There's one court that has already found that DOJ is acting like a federal agency with substantial independent authority to go into other agencies and access their computer systems and to take other actions like perhaps directing the firing of employees. And so I think there are really good arguments that plaintiffs have in these cases that DOJ is a federal agency rather than a presidential component. However, that's a legitimate dispute. That's not destroying records. That's a legal issue that will be resolved in multiple courts and will go up on appeal.
Sure.
That was a very long-winded answer to your question.
That's what podcasts are for. That's what this is for. But my final thing here, because we're running out of time, is how do we solve this issue of disappearing records? Is it a new law? Is it updating how we understand how apps like Signal are used? Where do we go from here?
Yes, I've argued, I've testified in the Senate in 2022 that agencies should automatically archive electronic messaging in one or more apps. They should dedicate one or more apps and say, use these for official business. And yes, people could do a workaround and use other types of apps, but most government employees will follow that rule. So technology is the answer. We can't rely on ourselves. We should be in a zero-click world. Everything is electronic. Everything is born digital. We have to think about technology archiving all of the records of government in electronic form. The National Archives is not taking in paper anymore. They said in June 2024, that's it. From now on, any records up anywhere in the government have to be electronic or digital if they're coming to the National Archives as permanent records, and that the rest of the government have to manage those records. So this includes electronic messaging. And the only answer here is technology to make it easy for people. They don't have to download anything or forward or copy anything. They should just, the system should work, but they have to use the right systems, especially if it's classified communications. That's a special extra set of requirements beyond record keeping that's at issue in this story.
Yeah. Well, Jason, thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate it. It was just a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Glad to be here.
I want to thank Jason for coming on the show again. If you want more from him, I've got a link to his Washington Monthly article about the former National Archivist, as well as his testimony in front of the Senate about classified materials and records keepings, and of course, the Atlantic article about this Signal chat where he's quoted. Those links will be in the description and show notes for this episode. And that is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show in whatever podcast app you listen to this on. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new episodes there. You can also subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack. It's just $5 a month, that bottom tier, and you'll get access to all of this great content that I'm putting out. And if not, please continue to share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Granthermes on X and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Granthermes, and I'll talk to you next week.